What you might not be aware of is that the UCI real estate program is all privately funded. So it's the funds are coming through the advisory board gift program, through donations, and through sponsorship of programs and events like today. And with those funds, what they do is they offer a very comprehensive real estate program, a certificated MBA in real estate, professional training, student development opportunities, research programs, and industry programs like today. I would really encourage all of you to consider being a sponsor and supporting these programs as I have and as F&M has. I think it's really rewarding, and it gives so much back to a really great cause at the end of the day. I'd like to kick off the event and introduce Ed, who will take care of kicking it off and introducing our great speakers. And Ed Carlson is the director of the Center for Real Estate, UCI Mirage School of Business. Ed, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Kathy. It's a fantastic introduction. Welcome, everybody. I'm very excited also for today's program. My name's Ed Carlson. I do have the honor and privilege and joy of being the director of the Center for Real Estate here at the Mirage School of Business at the University of California, Irvine. I am so pleased to have the chance to talk with three pals of mine, and we're going to talk about housing markets after, quote, after the pandemic. We can only hope. You've been given their bios, and very impressive bios. I don't need to read them all, but let me just introduce them very, very briefly. Lynn Fisher is the Deputy Director of Research and Statistics at the Federal Housing Finance Agency. FHFA has the job of supervising the government-sponsored enterprises, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and has other duties as well. And Lynn has been a friend of mine for 25 years, maybe. Michael Fratantoni is the chief economist and senior vice president for research and industry technology at Mortgage Bankers Association. And then finally, Jenny Schutz is the senior fellow at the Metropolitan Policy Program of the Brookings Institution, and also heads the Future of the Middle Class initiative. And I've known Mike and Jenny for a very long time as well. So welcome to all three of you. Let's get the panel started, shall we?
Morning, Ed.
Good morning. I should also say to everybody in attendance that as was mentioned, the Q&A is open, and if you have questions for our panelists, please enter them into the Q&A, and we'll get to as many as possible. We also had a number of questions that were submitted ahead of time, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can. I will try to interweave those into our discussion today. So first and foremost is the question of housing prices. It's something that's on everybody's mind, although there were some interviews. I don't know if anybody saw this, but there were interviews with the New York City mayoral candidates by the New York Times. And they asked each of those persons what they thought the average price of a house in Brooklyn was. And the answers range from the ridiculously low number of $80,000 all the way up to $1.8 million. The answer is actually somewhere around 900,000. So there's a lot of confusion about housing prices as well, I suppose, even among people who ought to know. But what's on everybody's mind is, will housing prices continue the trends that we've seen since the pandemic started? I'll take everybody back approximately 1 year when the shutdowns occurred, and there was general, not panic, but concern about housing markets, that the bottom would fall out or something, and nothing like that occurred. So let's start with Lynn. Where do you see house prices going? And if you can speak to regional and local trends as well as national trends, so much the better. But what do you think?
Well, and thanks for the question. And if we back up maybe to just prior to the pandemic, if we look at our national house price index, so house prices had settled down to about 5% year-over-year growth for the nation. A little bit of variation around the country, but everywhere was still seeing positive house price growth. And if you think about that, I don't know, 8-9 years into a house price cycle, that's still pretty fast growth, for as mature a housing cycle as we were already in. You get to the May timeframe last year, and house prices kind of paused a little bit. They didn't turn negative in any place that I'm aware of, but they certainly paused. And then as we started to get our sea legs back under us during the summer, appreciation really took off. There was a good bit of housing demand and change in housing demand that I think really got markets going. Interest rates were low and continuing to fall. And so by the time we fast forward to February of 2021, which is our most recent release, we're talking about 12.2% year-over-year growth in house prices. So we've sort of counterintuitively ended up, like you said, we didn't think we were going to see, we were concerned about housing markets a year ago, and now we see this absolutely astounding growth, pretty much double-digit increases around the country regionally. City by city, definitely seeing some more variation. San Francisco and California is seeing maybe just 2.4% growth year over year as of the end of 2020. So it's one of the slower places, but plenty of other locales in California that have seen a pickup in growth, I think, as during COVID, people have looked around and tried to figure out where they want to land. So maybe I'll stop there and take some other, see what others have to say.
Mike, anything to add to that?
Yeah, so when we think about housing demand, a couple of factors really driving that, right? Most importantly, demographics. And we look at the age structure of the population. You got 4.7 million 29-year-olds right now. You look in the US, peak first-time homebuyer age is 32, 33, 34, something like that. So we see that demographic picture as one that's going to be a steady tailwind for housing demand over the next several years. Add on to that, coming out of this recession, you have an improving job market, people feeling pretty optimistic if they're able to reestablish their income. And now we're going to see a tighter job market, growing wages that'll add to demand. Lynn said mortgage rates are low. So demand, just not concerned about it all. Assume for at least the next couple of years is going to be extremely strong. Supply has been the problem. Last year, people were unwilling to list their homes, understandably, didn't want people coming into the house. And builders had really been behind the 8 ball for years, not really matching the rate of household formation. Jenny knows quite a bit about some of the conversation around restrictions on adding density in various places where density is needed. But just this mismatch between demand and supply is leading to the double-digit price increases that Lynn mentioned.
Maybe in your position, you're the most assiduous Fed watcher amongst the 3 panelists. That's just a guess, but what do you think about where interest rates and mortgage rates are going to go over the next couple of years? We're hearing a lot of talk about rising interest rates in the near to moderate term.
Sure. So first, looking backwards, we got to all-time record lows in mortgage rates. The Freddie survey was as low as 2.6% at times last year. We're just below 3% on that Freddie Mac survey right now. We think we'll be above 3.5% by the end of the year. So historically speaking, that's still a low mortgage rate. From a mortgage market perspective, it's the change that matters, and sometimes more than the level. So that increase in mortgage rates is enough to turn off the refinance demand in many cases, but probably isn't going to be enough to really impact affordability. In terms of the Fed, they have pretty much locked themselves in to keeping short-term rates low through the next couple of years. So we have them on hold for the Fed funds target through 2022, then 2 hikes in 2023. the big question is what they're going to do with their QE purchases. So they've been adding to their balance sheet by 80 billion in treasuries and 40 billion in mortgage-backed securities every month. And they said they're going to keep doing that until they've made substantial further progress on their employment and inflation goals. We had kind of a quirky April job market number, but we think the unemployment rate will go from 6.1 in April to 4.5 by the end of the year. That's definitely substantial further progress. And the inflation number out this morning, greater than 4% year on year, certainly is enough to sort of perk their ears up. So we wouldn't be surprised if they cut back on those purchases starting later this year and start talking about that sometime later this summer.
Could I add just a piece on that to Mike's point about tapering, and Mike, see if you agree with me here. The reason that could be an upside risk to interest rates is it's not just about the 10-year, but the fact that secondary mortgage market rates relative to the 10-year are pretty compressed because of the activity of the Fed in the mortgage-backed securities market. So if they start to pull back, that spread could widen out, and that's, to me, at least a little bit of risk that rates could increase even faster in mortgage markets than the 10-year itself suggests.
Yeah, I'd agree. And that's in combination with just some of the competitive dynamics in the mortgage market. So in 2020, financial market disruption, spreads between mortgages and treasuries got extremely wide. As the refinance boom has ended, those spreads have come in. So now we're seeing mortgage rates move up at least 1-for-1 with treasuries. That's our expectation going forward. So to Lynn's point, unlike late last year, where mortgages seem to be doing their own thing, now you can expect any increase in treasuries to show up in a higher mortgage rate to the borrower.
As someone with an adjustable rate mortgage, I'm listening very intently to this. I got a great rate when I started, but I hear the refis, the call of the refi. Jenny, one of the things that people started talking about when the pandemic started, and we saw that the bottom was not going to fall out of the real estate market, was a shift in location. That people were less enamored of high density environments, that there had been a trend towards moving to high density areas because of the attractiveness, as it was then perceived, of dense areas because of the amenities that were involved. And then the thought was that trend was going to reverse and people were going to flee to the suburbs and less dense environments. Do you see that happening? And has that been reflected in the relative price of central city versus suburban units?
Yeah, there are definitely some interesting trends going on, both movements across metro areas and then within metro areas. It's not actually clear that this is sort of a change in direction. It looks a little bit like an acceleration of patterns that were already happening. So the biggest metros, the densest metros, New York and the San Franciscos, those were actually growing slower than some of the smaller places pre-pandemic, right? So places like Boise and Austin and Denver and Nashville, we've actually seen faster population growth rates in those kind of next tier metros for quite a while, in part because the big dense places are really expensive. They haven't been building enough housing to keep up with demand for 30 years. And so people have been deciding to move to places that are a little bit less expensive, but that still offer very strong job markets. Within metros, we've also seen the fastest growth is within lower density counties. So those tend to be kind of the exurbs on the fringe, rather than in either the urban core or the kind of mid-density suburbs. And again, a lot of this is just because people who wanted to live maybe in the urban core with all of the amenities couldn't afford housing there, right? So it was largely a matter of prices, not preferences. What we've seen in the pandemic is an accelerated shift in movement towards the Boise's and the Austins, places where you can still buy a house and you can buy a single family house and have a little bit of space without, going into hop forever. And within the biggest metros, essentially Manhattan and San Francisco are the places where we've seen the greatest outflow of people and kind of softening of the market, which makes a ton of sense. You live in Manhattan and San Francisco so that you can go out all the time and you don't care if you're living in a tiny apartment. When restaurants shut down and Broadway shuts down, there's no point paying those rents, right? But we've already started to see in a reverse, some of the people who left temporarily are going back. There's definitely a return to some of the places that have higher amenities. And my expectation is that when people are vaccinated and leisure and hospitality can come back safely, we're going to see preferences that look like they did pre-pandemic, right? Some people have chosen to buy a house in the suburbs and they're going to stay there. But all of the people who were finishing school, looking for a first job, who would have been moving into the urban core, delayed that, we're going to see that pick up again. So I don't see sort of a big divergence from long-term trends. And I will throw out there that some of the people who bought homes in the suburbs that are way out, assuming they're going to be working from home forever or working from home 4 days a week, may have to grapple with whether their employers will actually let them work from home in the long run. And we're certainly starting to see on the hiring side, on the employer side, some questions about whether that's really going to be the new norm.
Right. So what I'm hearing you say, all three of you actually, and I'm looking at the pre-sent questions. I'm trying to combine several of them into one question. So unlike 2008, I perceive you saying that this is not a bubble situation, that the trends that we're seeing are due to demographic and other fundamental factors. And so I hear you saying that. Do you agree with that statement? And a related question then from somebody, if you're a renter with a pretty good income, is 2021 the right time to buy a house? I'll throw that open to anybody.
So I would agree that we're not in a bubble, that the prices are being driven by fundamentals. There may be some recalibration across places depending on whether jobs stay remote or not. If you're a renter and thinking about buying, getting into the market for the first time, we'll say this is a great time to buy a condo in a core location with strong amenities and strong job market. The condo market has been really soft. And if you're looking to put some money in investment, that seems like a great place to put it.
Let me add one thing which was really different in 05 to 07. Maybe two things that were really different in 05 to 07. You did see a substantial amount of inventory on the market, even as prices were going up, and builders were matching all the demand they were seeing. A good portion of that demand was coming from buyers, let's just call them short-term holders, right? Looking to flip properties. I just don't see it right now. Right now, people looking to buy homes want to live there. that is a much more stable form of demand than someone looking for a short-term hold to flip a property after improving it. The second, and obviously closer to where a lot of my members were, 05 to 07 had some questionable practices when it came to the types of loans and underwriting that was being used. Mistakes, looking at it from this perspective. The regulatory changes that were made since then, an ability to repay rule, a qualified mortgage rule, have really locked in place some very sensible guardrails when it comes to the types of loans that can be made. So the price increases we're seeing now are not being fueled by mortgage credit, which is too loose. And Lynn and I work together on this to some extent. By some measures, our credit index right now is showing we're back to 2014 levels. So credit is tight, it's not loose. And yet buyers are still able to make competitive bids on these properties.
I agree with both Jenny and Mike. I think I might put on my regulator hat though and talk about a few risks. Given that supply is so inelastic, it's so slow to move, right? We're not going to get a lot of new, we are seeing builders trying to step up, but lumber prices, other things, I mean, that's going to be a very long haul to think that supply is going to come to the rescue here. When you have slow moving supply like that, demand has a much more emphatic impact on prices. And I do worry a little bit that people are worried about interest rates rising or pulling some demand forward. We're certainly hearing stories in different markets about people doing certain things like buying houses sight unseen, foregoing their inspection. There's a little psychology that can take over in really tight markets that can exacerbate things. And I do worry there is some frothiness in some places that are sort of fed by just the sheer tightness of the market. If you look at Redfin and other places, new listings aren't showing up as fast as we might like. But I think there's also an undercount in some of the data right now because stuff's flying off the shelf. Things aren't even making it to listings. We're not even counting those listings. They're flying right through. So things are moving fast, a little frothy in some places, and I think we need to keep our eyes peeled that we don't get a little overheating in some markets.
Right. There's a couple of very relevant questions in the Q&A, and one that was pre-sent, and they're going in 3 different directions. So I'm gonna go rapid fire here. There's a question which I would like to know the answer to, actually, and I think Jenny's the best one to address this. Is there any hard data showing a connection of moving to less dense areas and remote working? Is there any hard data that actually shows people are living farther away from their places of work, for example?
There's not a lot of that because the population data that we have, so the census has actually just put out their most recent county population estimates, which shows us the year-over-year change in population down to the county level. But that's, of course, aggregate, and it's not tied to the underlying micro data that tells us whether people are continuing to do their same job and moving. So we have different data sources on people working from home, right? The household surveys tell us whether people can work from home, and then we have the other data that tells us on location. So I haven't seen anything that links the 2 of those. Sort of, implicitly that there are more people working from home and that population is growing in these outlying areas, trying to match those up. But again, these are sort of continuations of existing trends. And it's also worth reminding everybody, most of us on this call are working from home, but it's not that big a share of the workforce overall, right? It was never more than, I think, about 35% at a given time. And we're down to maybe 18% of the workforce working from home now. It's a lot of bodies, but it's not a big share of the overall workforce.
Interesting. My friend, and maybe your friend, Amin, who is in Canada, actually, so thank you, Amin, for coming today, asks a very provocative question. Given that we've all said that this is based on fundamentals, how do we interpret the decline in average cap rates, the growing gap between rents and prices? Michael or Lynn?
Lynn, happy to jump in, or you want to?
No, I think there is evidence again that house price to rent ratios are starting to rise. I think we are trying to hold the line on the mortgage credit quality side. I agree with Mike on that front. But there is a lot of demand in the market right now. Mike mentioned the millennials, largest generation ever, but they are trying to coexist and co-home own with the other biggest generation ever, the boomers. So there is a lot of demand there, right? A lot of folks trying to push on that market. But when I look at the last year, I think there is some psychology involved. And so I can't discount, as I said a minute ago, that there's some froth.
So, Ed, I'd go back to your question about interest rates and say, that certainly plays into the fundamental analysis as well. And if you look at any asset across the entire system right now, valuations are high. You look at the stock market, you look at credit spreads on almost anything, and home prices are in there as well. And they certainly are being influenced by the Fed, other central banks around the world, keeping rates lower than they otherwise would be. And when central banks change that course with respect to the level of rates, then valuations will adjust. That's our expectation.
One of the things that people thought was a good thing in the 2000 to 2007 expansion was the fact that mortgages were more available to those of less means. And while there may have been some overreaction on the part of mortgage lenders and underwriters, housing opportunities did expand. In the current situation, and this goes to a question that was pre-sent to us, what is available to low-income borrowers who want to become homeowners that is maybe coming from the federal government?
So answering that a little bit indirectly, certainly one of the notable things about the last year is that we've seen this real divergence in the labor market between higher wage jobs, particularly college educated jobs that can be done remotely, and lower wage jobs, right? And so certainly one of the concerns is that people who weren't earning a ton of money before were more likely to lose either their job or to have hours cut back and have a more uncertain economic future. That translates into less buying power and also just less certainty about what your future income is going to look like. We've seen a divergence between owner-occupied market and rental market. And within rental markets, we've seen kind of softening at the high end as marginal home buyers buy their first home. But at the same time, there's actually more competition for some of the Class C apartments because people who are sort of, conserving on money at the bottom end of the labor market. So I'm concerned about both renters and homeowners who are at kind of the lower end of the income distribution. Owners have had more flexibility in deferring their mortgage payments, but this has been a horrible time for middle and low income renters. And I do worry also about the potential for that to carry over people who have accumulated rent debt, not being able to sort of re-engage fully in the economy.
Well, that brings us, Mike, I thought you were starting to say something about that, so.
Yeah, I think on the mortgage front, typically the biggest constraint to somebody becoming a homeowner is the challenge in accumulating a down payment, particularly if home prices are increasing, as Lynn said, 10 to 12% a year, and incomes are growing 3 or 4% a year. That makes it much more difficult for that first-time home buyer to get on the first rung of the ladder. There are programs for low down payments, whether through FHA or the other government agencies or through Fannie and Freddie. There are also numerous down payment assistance programs through state housing finance agencies. We can help with that down payment challenge. And now in Congress, there is a debate around a potential first-time homebuyer tax credit with a real push on making that fully refundable. And there's even an idea of making it advanceable. So it would arrive at the closing table for the buyer. So, really lots of effort to try to address that down payment constraint, which is often the biggest challenge for a qualified buyer.
Lynn, any comment on that?
I think those are the obvious things. I think we might talk about supply later and the availability of smaller units, right? To buy a lower priced home might require us to supply some other things. So I might wait for that conversation to start in a second.
Yeah. So yes, it does bring us to one of the big elephants in the room, which is the question of affordability. There's a question and there's a comment and question in the chat, which I'll just read here because it's a very nice comment. Mike talked about the younger demographic providing a tailwind for housing demand, but that demographic has affordability issues, particularly here in Orange County. And it trickles down to the rental market, which we have not talked about very much, and we should. So a kind of a basic question. I should add, I just looked this morning at the median house price figure for Orange County, and it has dropped in the last month by about 1 or 2%. So it's quite a remarkable drop. Still over $1 million, but hey, it's the median, so half the prices here are under $1 million. Jenny, what do we mean by affordability, first of all?
Yeah, that's always a tricky question. And I like to separate out affordability issues into kind of two buckets. So affordability really is the intersection between prices or rents on one hand and income, right? So HUD estimates that people should spend no more than 30% of their income on housing costs. The poorest 20% of Americans everywhere in the country are spending well over half of their income on housing costs. So both renters and owners everywhere from Orange County and San Francisco to rural Kansas and Texas, the poorest 20% of households essentially can't afford the cost of market rate housing without a subsidy. And that's largely an income problem. It's not necessarily a housing cost problem. They're just people who earn really low wages and in many cases don't work 40 hours a week and so don't earn a full income. The other problem that's probably more salient to California is that there are places, most of the West Coast, large East Coast metros, DC, New York, Boston, that haven't been building enough housing to keep up with demand for about 30 years now. And so the price of housing in those markets is artificially high because there isn't enough supply. These are very productive metros with highly paid jobs and people chasing after too few units. So those are two separate affordability problems. One of them is about supply and one of them is about incomes and labor markets. And that's important to remember because the policy solutions to them are going to look really different.
So, I mean, the next question I have on my sheet here is this affordability problem that we have simply solved by building more units? And I think what Lynn was starting to say, and which something I wholeheartedly agree with, is that it's not just building more units, but building the right kind of units. Lynn, do you want to expand on what you were going to say before?
Yeah, I think that's exactly where I was going. And but to answer your question, just building more only handles the second part of Jenny's definition, not necessarily the first part. There's always going to be an income level at which, housing is too expensive, and there's other sorts of solutions to that problem. But to the second half of her definition, where we just have markets where housing is too affordable because we have not been building enough, that means also that our housing stock in these places is really old. It's, we keep trying to put lipstick on a pig because that's the housing we have. Building more densely, not necessarily skyrise densely, but duplexes instead of single family homes, more condos, walk-ups. There are ways to add density that fit the neighborhood, fit our lifestyles, but which afford people, just a lower price tag home by virtue of buying a little bit less house. And that, is something we used to do very well. It's something that I think has certainly been affected by zoning and other types of regulation over time. And certainly is an issue on both coasts. So I'll leave it there.
Yeah.
Can I add one point in?
All right, go ahead.
This is an issue where I think you would find a broad swath of people and just answering a clear yes to your question. Building more will answer it. And why I say that is at the end of the Obama administration, the Council of Economic Advisors put out a report saying the answer to the supply challenges is for states and localities to relax zoning, which artificially restrict the amount of construction. At the end of the Trump administration, the Trump Affordable Housing Group put out a paper said, the answer to the affordable housing challenge is to relax zoning, and states and localities should stop artificially restricting construction. So to me, that, I'm in Washington, that sure sounds like a bipartisan consensus that states and localities need to do more. I know Lynn's very expert on, what Massachusetts did to try to address it with some level of success. I know California has tried with less success thus far, I guess, than Massachusetts has had, but it seems like that's a useful margin to be operating on right now.
Yeah,
Jenny, I say the word Jenny and zoning, and I expect a lot of smart things to occur here.
Yeah, so I think there is a lot of consensus, certainly among urban economists, among housing policy analysts, and Mike is right, this is one of the few areas where there is some bipartisan consensus. There are parts of the country that need to be building both more in total quantity, and most parts of the country should be building more smaller housing, denser housing. As Lynn said, what exactly that looks like does differ across places a little bit, whether that's smaller single family homes or townhomes, or whether that's more, 4 to 6 story apartments. I will say one of the interesting things that's been going on the last couple of years is that state governments are getting much more engaged in the question of zoning, regulation, and housing supply. So traditionally that's been regulated at the local level. Cities and counties are the ones who adopt zoning regulations, who enforce things like building codes, And so most of this has been kind of left up to cities to either do well or do badly. States are starting to get get a clue that it affects regional labor markets, right? And California is a great example. The governor would like there to be booming labor markets and lots of jobs, employers able to hire and retain good workers, who contribute their income taxes to the state budget. And when labor markets aren't doing well, the state worries about that. States are actually a great unit of government to push back on restrictive zoning because states give local governments their powers over land use, and they have the authority to take that back. They also have a bunch of fiscal tools to change the incentive. So Len has obviously done a lot of work on Massachusetts 40B, which has been a builder's remedy. So builders can appeal to build higher density housing if there isn't a threshold of affordability. Massachusetts in January did something else that's really new. They passed a statewide law saying that every local jurisdiction that has a commuter rail station has to create a district that allows multifamily housing by right. And that's huge because there are a ton of commuter rail stations in very low density, very expensive and exclusive suburbs that don't allow anything except single family homes on big yards. And those places now have to create a multifamily district. The implementing regulations are going to be tricky, and it'll take a while, I think, to see how effective it is. But states getting involved to essentially to get regional labor markets back on track, that is a new trend, and I think something that's very promising.
And I might tie a little bit of what Mike said together with what Jenny was just talking about. And I know they both mentioned Massachusetts. When I was doing a lot of research there, folks would ask, do we need to mandate affordable housing? Do we need to mandate units be built that have income restrictions on it versus, should these be market rate units or what have you? And implicit in the question you asked was, is just building anything good enough? And sometimes I think it is worth saying that any supply is probably not the right way to go about it, but supply is good because I mentioned, the housing stock is old. People with high incomes are perhaps living in housing units that might optimally be occupied by others. If you give folks different choices, they will start to move, right? So no matter what kind of units hit the ground, there's the possibility of freeing up units for folks at different parts of the income distribution. So getting very concerned and very bunched up about, do we have to do certain types of construction versus others? Sometimes more supply is just enough. Figuring out exactly what types have to be built and trying to make very complicated rules around these things, I think sort of misses the point sometimes. It's not that there aren't certain groups that are underserved and could use a little boost, but more supply generally creates some slack in the system so that units are freed up for folks in different parts of the income distribution, and where you create that new stuff might not be as important as just getting it created.
We talk about California for a moment, since we're talking about state level initiatives. Do you think there's lessons in the Massachusetts experience for California? We've had several bills that tried to address affordability and density and zoning at the state level, and they've all failed.
Yep. It is about, Jenny pointed right to it, right? And maybe I'll quote my director for a minute. Supply is a national problem with local roots. You still have to get local entities to make different decisions or to take other factors into account when they're making decisions. And the state, if that's going to be the actor that's requiring that, has to have enforcement power to some degree. The thing that was strong in Massachusetts and made the rules work is that there was a fairly clear set of rules that did give power to developers to override local rules and zoning in certain circumstances, but there was an administrative court that would enforce those rules. And without sort of that independent enforcement of the desired outcome, it becomes very much a political decision that can be kind of nipped away. The edges of any policy become sort of dulled by the political process. And so the thing that worked in Massachusetts, and I can't opine on whether it would work in California, was that there was a relatively strong kind of legal enforcement regime that went along with, you know, the state's grant of that power to developers.
I mean, the odd thing is that California, in some sense, has more of a state role in land use planning than most
Always
other
has.
states. I mean, you know, there are these regional housing needs allocations. And so in theory, for decades now, the state has been telling local governments, you need to build more, and even saying you need to build more at certain kinds of price points or income price points. But there really haven't been teeth to enforce that. And I know that DHCD is trying to get better about that, has a new methodology. You know, I will say that California likes to make things complicated. So rather than just say, you need to build more housing and we're going to take things away, you know, they create a very complicated new methodology. And, you know, a couple of lawyers at UC Davis have just written a 40-page brief to explain the new framework for enforcing RNHA. And, you know, if it takes a 40-page brief written by lawyers, it's also going to be something that lawyers can figure out how to work around, right? Local governments barely understand what they're supposed to do, and they can certainly hire lawyers to figure out how to find the loopholes. So I'm like, I wish California would simplify things. The part of the problem is that just the housing politics in California are so ugly and so entrenched, and groups are so dug in on their positions that it's really difficult even to get fairly straightforward kind of marginal improvements through the legislature. I don't know how you fix the politics, right? You're not going to get better policy until you get better politics, and that's just really hard.
And obviously a very different situation, but the change in Minnesota to relax any requirements for single family zoning, that's a nice little natural experiment. To Jenny's point, like the fact that there are experiments being done in different states and localities around the country is helpful. And then can certainly make a pitch for Connor Doherty's book. I can understand California from a data perspective, but reading those stories, it wasn't San Francisco. It's these tiny little, neighborhood level decisions within the Bay Area that are driving this restriction. It's fascinating.
There's some parallels in Orange County too.
Well, I heard just before the pandemic, I heard you, Jenny, speak on California building patterns. And if I remember right, Irvine was a shining beacon compared to the rest of Orange County. Do you still hold that view?
Irvine is actually a shining beacon compared to much of the state of California. No, I mean, the astonishing thing is that Irvine has been building and has built substantially more multifamily housing than most other places with an equivalent income. It has to help that the Irvine company is headquartered there. And in a sense, you have a more unified real estate market than you have in other places. But yeah, relative to your neighbors in Orange County, you guys are doing great.
I don't actually live in Irvine, but they are building condos and apartments where I live as well, quite a bit, in fact. Let's move on. I think, right. So I wanted to change gears just a little bit, perhaps briefly, perhaps not, but I wanted to get a sense from Lynn what's going on with Fannie and Freddie. Just before the pandemic, in the late 2019, there were at least one and maybe two proposals, substantial proposals for reforming the GSEs, Fannie and Freddie. What is the state of GSE reform, and where do we move from here?
Well, all great questions, Ed. And I think, GSE reform is sort of something that Congress has to take on. If we want something different, if we want a different charter, if we want different entities, Congress really has to take that on in some ways, because right now Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae have particular charters that they were granted, by Congress, and they have to operate within those. They were imagined as private companies with sort of a government mandate to provide liquidity to mortgage markets. And so you kind of have a little bit of a tale of two worlds. One is the world in which we're operating, and one is the world in which others would have to join in order to kind of change the status quo. The current kind of path that FHFA is following is the status quo. And that is one in which there's probably, the director has both a statutory mandate and authority to put the enterprises in a safe and sound condition. And if they do that, then they probably ought to be private entities again. I think most folks at this event probably recognize Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac have been in conservatorship for about 12 years now, 11, 12 years. So they've been in legal limbo in a sense, right? FHFA has a large role to play in how they operate on a day-to-day basis. And that might not be, the best way to run a company, is to kind of have them in perpetual bankruptcy, if you will. The lawyers will shoot me for saying bankruptcy, but it's the best analogy for many as to what conservatorship really is. What we're up to right now is trying to make sure that we keep advancing that cause of getting them to be safe and sound, allowing them to build capital. So as of the end of the year, the enterprises are allowed to retain their earnings and start to build capital that would be required for them to become private entities again. And the FHFA's kind of path forward is to continue to put guide rails, if you will, around how they will operate as private entities. So to create a capital rule, to create a rule about resolution planning, which means they have to create living wills that, should anything bad ever happen in the future, anticipates how they would evolve into the next phase of life. Putting things like liquidity rules in place that just say, hey, you should operate with safe and sound practices. At the same time, we're making FHFA a stronger regulator. We've created a division of research and statistics. That's brand new to the agency, beefing up the exam side of the house. We've created a division of resolution. So right now, the path forward, absent sort of bipartisan agreement in Congress, is to keep moving them forward towards regaining their private status. But that's a long road without further conversations with U.S. Treasury in particular.
Mike, what's the MBA's stance towards GSE reform?
Yeah, so we obviously have been actively involved in thinking about what a better system would look like, and have put out multiple papers and studies through the years. And to Lynn's point, unfortunately, Congress hasn't acted to make the changes that are necessary to permanently put them on a more stable footing. It's unfortunate, they are involved in about half of the mortgage market in a given year. Last year it was in excess of 60% of the mortgage market. They're incredibly important actors. They need to be on more stable footing than they are. And as Lynn mentioned, right now, FHFA, the regulator, involved in sort of day-to-day oversight of the companies. And so they're even a more sort of curious institution than they were previously with private companies with the government connections. Now it's a much more overt government direction of what they're doing. From a business standpoint, it can be challenging because then you're introducing policy volatility with each change in administration in terms of views about the right footprint for where they should be operating, the types of activities they should be involved in, and thoughts about sort of the direction of where they should be heading absent congressional direction. So it's a very challenging environment for the industry.
I'll just say, I don't have particularly strong views on sort of the right long-term model, but I think the last year has shown us some advantages from sort of a bigger policy perspective of having more direct government levers on the mortgage side of the market than on the rental side of the market, right? So Fannie and Freddie were able to grant a year's worth of mortgage forbearance to borrowers, essentially with a stroke of the pen. And, there's no comparable mechanism for kind of providing rent relief. Fannie and Freddie, if they were to stay in sort of longer term under regulation, a little more kind of utility model, there's the opportunity to use mortgage markets to accomplish some bigger policy goals. One of the ones I'm thinking of is climate change. So Matt Kahn has a nice paper out recently looking at sort of the lack of climate risk pricing in mortgages. Fannie and Freddie are backing a lot of properties in places that are going to see even more climate damage than they have so far. And yet that's not built into the pricing at all. And to enable climate pricing to show up in mortgages currently would require explicit sign off by Congress, right? That's not something the agencies can do on their own. That's the kind of policy goal that it might be nice to accomplish through them. But I completely agree with Mike that sort of, policy changes depending on what Congress wants to do and the administration wants to do, and not knowing every 4 years whether there's going to be kind of a giant U-turn on the direction of the agencies does create a lot of risk and uncertainty.
I might just to round that out, suggest that I'm not sure that the structure, the ownership structure, how they're operating is necessary to achieve some of what's gone. I think if they were private entities, we could have still done the forbearance policies. They could have flowed through. The agency, FHFA, is actually, we now have a natural disaster and climate working group. There's a lot of work being done throughout many federal agencies on climate. And a lot of those things can be addressed and sort of captured through things like your capital rule and requirements about capital. And the private market might actually price some of these things better than a captured entity. So I think there's, this relationship with the federal government won't distinguish or extinguish rather under a variety of different future states. I think a lot of that could be accomplished, in many of those different alternatives.
Well, Jenny, you mentioned forbearance, and of course that's something that's prominent right now, both in the rental markets and in mortgage markets. There's been eviction moratoria, there's been extended rental relief in some areas. There's been a number of policies that have tried to stabilize the mortgage market and the rental market, perhaps more importantly. Do you want to comment on those?
I can comment on the rental side. I'll leave the owner-occupied side to Lynn and Mike. On the rental side, I think what the pandemic has really exposed is how fragmented and decentralized it is, and sort of a lack of consistent rules and governance, right? So the federal government doesn't regulate rental markets. State governments regulate landlord-tenant laws, and there's enormous variation across states in even basic kind of tenant protection. So what can go into a lease? What's the length of time tenants are in default before landlords can begin eviction proceedings? Do tenants have a right to counsel? So like all of that varies across states, and they're implemented through county court systems. So there's variation even within state in how the eviction moratorium has been interpreted. It's been really important to keep people in their homes. The method of doing this sort of, on the one hand, landlords can't evict, and on the other hand, we're going to try to provide some rent relief. The amount of rent relief is well short of the amount of rent debt, and the rent relief programs have been sort of stood up in a hurry, run through local governments that are overwhelmed and have never done this before. So I think the basic thinking behind both of those policies was sort of in the right direction, but the implementation has been, we'll say, messy is probably the kindest term.
Do you see any downside to these policies in terms of, getting builders to build more, for example?
I think there's short-term downsides, and there are potentially some longer-term downsides that we haven't yet started to see. I mean, in the short run, landlords who have pretty thin margins aren't getting income, and there are some properties that have had 30 to 40% or more income loss over a period of a year. I mean, it's hard to run a property that way and keep it up and running, right? So the properties become less habitable. Property owners are having trouble making mortgage payments and making property tax payments. There's going to be, I imagine, some instability, particularly in kind of the lower end rental market, properties that go into distress, which is never good for tenants, right? So this doesn't help anybody. And I think over the longer run, it raises some uncertainty about whether you want to be a landlord, particularly for sort of smaller owners. If you are a person, a family who potentially could own a rental property as a source of income, do you want to own that and rent it out, knowing that there's this sort of, uncertainty about whether the government will order you to provide housing for free for an extended period of time? And if for people on the progressive side who would like to have more tenant protections, making rental property unprofitable doesn't necessarily induce more people to own property and doesn't induce better landlords and better quality provision of rental housing. So I worry about swinging too far in that direction.
Mike and/or Lynn, do you want to comment on mortgage forbearance? Is this good in the short term but bad in the long term? What's your thoughts?
Yeah. So I think it's been an incredibly positive policy experiment to use a tool which had been used in hurricane and other natural disaster events that were very localized, to make it large scale, national. Anybody could get mortgage forbearance, just saying they had a hardship due to the pandemic. Could initially get 12 months. Now you can get it to 18 months of forbearance. But we're tracking that data weekly, not just tracking the levels, but also tracking how people are exiting forbearance. And what we're seeing is about 3/4 who exit are going back and making their original payment. So they've got their job back, they've got their income, they're moving forward. The remaining quarter need a modification, so they need a lower payment for a period of time as they're getting back on their feet. But at least thus far, it sure looks like a very, very successful experiment. There are going to be challenges because the folks staying in forbearance for that full 18 months probably are telling you they're having the toughest time. But thus far, I think it's been remarkable that 5 million plus homeowners have been helped through this episode. They have likely a payment to make when they sell their home or pay off their mortgage, but it's been very successful.
Yeah, I have to agree with Mike on the relative success of the program. I mean, if you think about what COVID was, it was this big outside of everybody's control shock to the market. Folks needed a chance to catch their breath. In contrast to what Jenny was just saying about sort of the fragmented rental market, we had this very kind of unified ability to provide relief on the homeowner side, at least for those who had mortgages in a concerted fashion, in a fairly uniform fashion, that I think did have great effect over the course of this year and will mean that the market really survives in a way that it probably couldn't have in the past. So I think that's all good stuff. Lots of details had to be worked out. It's been a busy year, I've just got to say. But some of the things that will influence, I think, whether this has a longer term impact on how investors view the MBS market or how other programs develop will be how we tail all of this off. We have some really tricky decisions coming up about things like foreclosure and eviction moratoriums. Mike said now we're down, a lot of people have resolved out of forbearance. We have tougher problems to solve now. We need to figure out these modifications. That puts a lot of burden on industry to have those conversations and get it all worked out. So we still have to figure out how we're going to wind this down and kind of get ourselves back into a steady state. And so there's some pretty tricky questions coming up about winding down foreclosure moratoriums in particular, because absent that, sometimes it's hard to get borrowers to talk to you. Absent that threat. And so it's a very tricky set of legal circumstances that we now have to navigate to continue to operate effectively.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. This has been an absolutely fascinating conversation. Any final last words, 25 words or less from any of you?
Thank you for having me. Appreciate the time. Always good to see friends and have a good conversation.
California, get your housing politics in order. Be able to write more good papers about you guys coming up with great policies.
Yeah. Good luck with all.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Lynn. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Jenny. And thank you, Kathy, for your sponsorship. This has been a great conversation, as I said, and thank you to everybody in the audience for the great questions. I apologize for not getting to absolutely every single one of them, but I'm available to talk about housing to any of you at any time. So have a great rest of your day, everybody. Have a great week, and hope to see you all soon. Thank you so much.